uh, and trying to put it into their free energy principle. They wanted to define culture in certain ways, and the parameters for that is as the story goes, human acquires norms, tastes, preferences, and ways of doing things that are consistent with those of others in their local world and communities. That is relevant social groups. So it's important to remember in this case that it is in groups and out groups. So there's this dichotomy between kind of like, I guess, what we talk about in internal states and external states, and that becomes more important in the new TTOM theory. Another quote from this paper is that, as developmental psychologists have argued, it is precisely because of the existence of intergroup behavioral and cognitive variations that arrive through social learning within members of the same species that we can speak of culture. And the last quote from the authors is that although it is clear that specific developmental experiences governed by, sorry, my screen just governed by explicit social norms and contexts, share these perceptual, cognitive, and attitudinal processes. Most of cultural learning appears to be implicit in the same that it occurs without explicit instructions. And I highlighted in yellow because this becomes more relevant later on when we talk about the critiques and kind of limitations of these models. So the section one, they talk about the existing theory about what they call a theory of mind, that they call it mind reading, perspective taking, joint intentionality, folk psychology, and mentalizing. And the existing theory of mind states that it is the human ability to ascribe mental states, intentions, and feelings to other agents and to oneself. And the author said that the three main critiques was that in doing so, it doesn't take into account different variations in different cultures. So in the paper, they gave a Melanesian example where the culture does not do as much what they call kind of like internalizing state. So they don't they don't try to ascribe feelings to another human agent. And so there are definitely cultural variations with cultures that are more based on that have the internal external dichotomy, and some that do not. A second critique was the embodiment critique. What they talk about is that this only works because it's based on processes that are contingent on language. And so in cases where things are being transmitted where it is not based on language, it would be considered non-implicit within this framework. And then the last one is a cooperativity critique. And this talks about the cooperative division of cognitive neighbor or cognitive outsourcing. So it doesn't address the issues where there may be what they call cognitive outsourcing. That is that instead of individuals kind of learning culture, they would learn it by observing, and that they would kind of ascribe what they call authority or prestige to the people that have done these things around them. So these are just kind of three kind of fundamental critiques of the theory of mind theory. And so what the authors are trying to say that they're trying to incorporate a number of different ideas from a number of different disciplines, and they call it the thinking through other minds theory, or what I call the TTOM model. And so the TOM model, as it states, is that there is an internal cognitive process of theory building or assimilation versus the external social cultural processes of interaction and cooperation. And so the TTOM model will integrate a number of these, and then they actually put it within the variational free energy principle framework. And so this one provides an interaction model that can explain the acquisition, production, and stabilization of cultural expectations. I just put multiple citations in paper because Daniel, I think one of Daniel's citations on Friston was also cited in a number of times in this article. And so the TTOM model breaks it down into expectations and cultural affordances. So what they talk about when they try to define implicit and explicit is that implicit means that it's automatic or learned to be automatic. So they give an example on the paper where if you were to see food, then your mind would start to tell your tongue to generate saliva or to masticate, and your stomach acid would start to secrete in order to prepare for the food to be ingested. And that would be a kind of biologically wired function when you see something that you know you're going to eat versus something that is considered explicit, that is taught and learned, and also reflected upon. So this is acquired. And they have the examples in the paper talk about children at a very young age also learning and acquiring these skills, but it is not implicit in the way that, like, if you were to uh, put some food in front of a child, that they would start to salivate and want to eat the food. And then another uh, area that they talk about in the paper is the difference between dogma, which is the official doctrine, and doxa, which is a common belief. And what the paper is interested in is what they call the doxa of backstage behavior. So, for example, if you are out in an office and you're working, you would be more likely to follow dogma, which is kind of like the rules that govern how things are working in the outside world, as in the working world. But when you're coming home, you might be a bit more lenient on the dogma and relax into what they consider your doxa. So you might not be as formal when addressing people within your family, or you might be in a more relaxed state of mind and you might change, let's say, like how you speak to one another. Um, or that you wouldn't be like sitting upright at your desk doing work, you'd be more relaxed sitting on your couch. And then another important term for this is the affordance. So affordance, what they consider affordance is to afford possibilities for engagement or a relation between an agent's abilities and the physical states of its environment. And the brain only has direct, so what they're talking about here is that how do you learn cultural affordances? Because the brain is what they consider a secluded state because it's inside your skull. And the only way that it can access the environment or the external world is having sensory input. And so this kind of relates to the free energy principle because it's trying to overcome this, what they call problematic seclusion, by matching the statistical organization of its states, which is kind of like the internal states, to the statistical structure of causal regularities in the world. So that's kind of the external state. And so it takes into account the free energy principle because it's saying that the brain can modify itself or can have an agency to change something so that it will try to match its statistical nature closer to its internal states. And so they call it a generative model, and that underwrites or informs perception and action over time. And so an example in the paper was talking about, let's say you're crossing campus and you see a well-worn path. You might not necessarily know where the path is going, but you believe, or you have the belief that if you were to take this path, it might take you to where you're going in a lesser amount of time. They also give a similar example of traffic signals. And so over time, there is the ability to change the traffic light signals in response to you, depending on the number of people and when they cross the street. Or in the case of the path, is that over time, that will become the well-worn path, and that will become, I guess, what they would call like a new aspect of culture where everyone else will also take the same path because other people will ascribe the people who have taken this path before some level of prestige or authority, having known better to take this path. So I think this is what I interpret the paper to mean when they talk about generative model and also having the ability to kind of change things around the environment so that it becomes like that becomes a more clear path that you would take through the campus. And so what they call active inference, and this is right, this is within the framework of free energy principles, that the variational free energy will always be bigger than the surprise. So going back to earlier lectures when we talk about free energy equals energy minus surprise, this makes sense because it talks about the variational free energy being bigger than the surprise. And so this is so I felt like that was actually, that kind of took in the FEP quite well. So then it actually goes a little bit further down into what they talk about in terms of attention, learning, novelty, and salience. So now when the information is coming in. And I think it was actually referred to also in Daniel's paper about weighted inputs. So they give the example of a rabbit and listening for a fox in the field. So when they talk about sensory precision in this model, they're talking about how precise or reliable is the sensory information coming in. So for example, if the rabbit was sitting in the field, how reliable is the information coming to the rabbit's ears when it thinks it hears a fox footstep nearby, which is different from prior precision, which is the weight of the beliefs given the expectations about prior experiences. So that would be the rabbit hearing something in that same patch of grass and kind of putting the weight on its information from before of how likely is it that if the rabbit was in this patch of grass, it might hear the footsteps or the paw steps of a fox walking by. And so then it kind of also, the paper goes further down to talk about the salience of the information, which is not the same as the attentional salience. So there's different aspects of the weight that you put on the information that's coming in and how do you filter that out. So this kind of explores a little bit further than the theory of mind because it breaks it down into how does it actually determine this. And so in the, I think it was in also Daniel's paper when they talked about prediction error. So they talk about having a number of sensory inputs coming in, and I'm trying to quickly find the graph here. The predictions coming in, and then having that measure of prediction error. So there might be a number of predictions coming in, and then it would actually go feed into like, well, what kind of errors might the prediction generate? And out of that information, how is it then weighted? And then out of that, then it kind of gets integrated into what they called shared expectations about norms and conventions and regimes of attention. And then it gets, after the weighted input, given the prior precisions of the sensory information coming in, how does it actually change internal state? So I think that kind of goes back to the earlier lectures of the ability to have a generative model where you're constantly adjusting things so that it will match what you see externally and become, it will minimize prediction error. And so I had the pictures of Bart drinking the squishy before. That was actually supposed to be reminding me the example of the idea of affordance, or an example of affordance of the ability or the possibility to afford that, like a cup. I think the example in the paper was that a cup affords drinking and the hand affords you to take the cup to drink. And so that's why I put the picture of Bart drinking there. And so, and when they talk about novelty seeking behavior, so this is the case of like, well, we seem to have human behaviors that want to seek out surprise. So that kind of like at first is counterintuitive to this idea of minimizing surprise in your environment. And so they consider this as the game of maximizing the epistemic affordance. So the idea is that you seek out surprise so that you can reduce entropy, or you can reduce the surprise later down the line. And so the paper then talks about artificial curiosity in neurorobotics as a form of intrinsic motivation, and as this idea of like a baby playing peekaboo with its mother, which is the example in the paper. And so when the baby actually sees the mother, it derives a source of delight or kind of like positive emotions because it has now reduced the surprise. I mean, so when the baby has his eyes covered, it doesn't know where the mother is. And then when the hands come down, then the baby is like, oh, I have now reduced entropy or surprise in my environment because now I know where my mother is. And so this, what they called adaptive exploration or epistemic foraging of this space of policies over longer time scales will lead to the local increase of in free energy will serve the more general process of reducing free energy. So this talks about kind of I see it as like individuals that will do what they call this epistemic foraging, or trying to seek out novelty or have like novelty seeking behaviors, is trying to reduce the entropy on like a bigger scale over a longer time scale. And so when individual agents do not know what is situationally appropriate, they call this, the behavior will switch to epistemic foraging, in which agents will preferentially sample whatever other relevant agents sample as well. So this is kind of like when you don't really know what to do, you start looking at other people and trying to observe what they are doing. And so this is also an example of outsourcing cognition, because you are again relying on people that have done other things before you and ascribing authority to them. And so I think this, see what the next slide is. So going back to that slide, I'll go with this one. So I'll go back to the other slides. This example of collective and cognitive outsourcing, I see it as like, so when I was looking at this, I was thinking, well, why would someone be writing all this, like we're writing this new music, but in writing this new music or doing these pieces of art installations or sound art, we're not really reducing surprise in our immediate individual life, because we're engaging in this novelty seeking behavior, and we're trying to do new things, we're experimenting. And I interpret the paper as that when we individuals as artists are doing this, we're actually trying to, over a longer time scale, reduce surprise for our larger group of people. Another example is kind of thinking, well, why do I like going to the art museum to look at paintings? And one way of looking at it is that if I went to the art museum and I looked at enough paintings, then maybe I would have acquired some knowledge that might help me somewhere down the line in terms of things about the culture from the paintings. So I saw that I saw the FEP principle applying to at least experimental music over like a longer time scale and in a larger group, because immediately at my individual level, it doesn't quite reduce surprise, but on a longer time scale and maybe on like a different community level, a different scale, it might. And so going back to the limitations of this paper, is that it does kind of make these assumptions about cultural ensembles kind of being more or less isolated, and it doesn't account quite as well for the fluctuations and change. When I talk about allostasis it's homeostasis, it doesn't quite take into account how things change very quickly in terms of people that immigrate or migrate. So it's kind of like saying that these cultural artifacts are kind of like within this group. And of course, over time, it will change. So this is like just kind of, there are some limitations on how certain things are kind of reduced in a way for this concept and this model to work. And they had an interesting application to what they call computational psychiatry, but I think that requires more work to flesh out, because they talked about applying this to depression and other psychiatric disorders, but I feel that because that is so individualized, that I'm not sure about further information or accommodations or modification to this model, how that might work. There might be some general knowledge that you can take from it by looking at like a larger sample size of depressed patients, for example. But there would be definitely I would have more skepticism towards that. I just put an example of Homer in the episode where he had no beer and he went crazy. There's just a little picture for that. And so one of the open peer commentary was from Bjorn Vikhoff on, it's a very short response to participating in the musician stream of consciousness. And so this article talks about music is governed by custom defining the style. It almost invariably follows some system creating expectancies. Implicated, sorry, I just made a typo, known and applied by musicians and listeners. And these musical styles tend to shape what they call neotribes. And so it's a slightly, I think what the article is trying to say, that it doesn't take into account some of the things that we observe within music and how I think they talked about the formation of genres or subgenres, and this commentary also talked about the idea of performance as a co-performance, that the composer is no, I think it's the audience is actually co-performing with the performers, and that surprises in this case attracts attention, and you don't want to minimize the surprise in the piece of music. But again, with new music, it's very different from saying like having an audience that has been in culture to think about a dominant gotatonic and having that as like a surprise, or maybe not a surprise, or when the five goes to the one, it minimizes the surprise. And so this model requires a little bit more work in fleshing out how would it take into account how other people from other cultures that maybe don't have those ascribing states, like the Melanesian example that I mentioned earlier, or cultures where they don't hear 5/1 as a minimizing surprise, like where they hear 5/1 as very strange. So it doesn't take into account, but it's a good starting point. But it also, there was a lot of criticisms in some aspects of this paper especially when they talked about cultures, because then I think someone said that I talked about like how this kind of paves the way, or kind of be one of the conclusions could be moving towards cultural fitness, and then it became some sort of link to social Darwinism, and it was not. It was a very academically scathing article, but written in academic terms. And so there was a number of critiques that was on this paper, but it seemed to generate a lot of really good responses. And I just wanted to have the closing of my short discussion as an example of novelty-seeking behavior and the consequences of, but how it might minimize surprise down the line. So, I'll just let you watch this.
Testing. Testing.
And so I just wanted to end that with the example of surprise-seeking behavior and the consequences of, and hopefully in that case, maybe that they will learn further down the line to not ever put 100 microphones all in sequence to magnify. I don't know if that actually will happen in real life. I just thought that that was a musically applicable example for novelty-seeking behavior. And that is the end of my summary of the paper.